Welcome to Boroughs and Burbs with hosts John Engel and Roberto Cabrera. Over the next hour, you're going to learn some insider knowledge that will help you overcome and strategize in the cutthroat world of real estate. Now, here are your hosts, John and Roberto.
Welcome to Boroughs and Burbs 89, the Brooklyn Show. I'm John Engel of Douglas Elliman in Connecticut, and that's my co-host.
I'm Roberto Cabrera, and I'm with Brown Harris Stevens on the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
West 75th Street, as I recall, in Manhattan. I want to thank our sponsor, Grace Farms, found at gracefarms.org. You might know them from their award-winning architecture, the River Building on their 80-acre campus in New Canaan. You might know them from the world-class events and conferences that take place throughout the year with the UN. But I know them from Design for Freedom, an initiative to end forced labor in the building materials that go into our homes, offices, and public spaces. Design for Freedom. How do you find out about it? Go to gracefarms.org, read about Design for Freedom, order some of their fair trade coffee and tea, and consider giving the gift of Grace Farms sips and drips as your next client gift. Use coupon code Burbs for 10% off your first order. Today, we are in Brooklyn. This is the Brooklyn Show. Jared LeFrenais met me in London and said, it's time Boroughs and Burbs came to Brooklyn. And so we did. Roberto said, if you're going to Brooklyn, we have to ask Lee Solomon. Lee is Brooklyn. And lest we make this show about realtors talking to realtors, we had to Katie Lydon, who has been on the show, I think 2-3 times before and has done many designs in Brooklyn. Lisa Ben Isvy, wave, Lisa. Lisa said, if you're going to ask a Brooklyn designer to be on the show, it better be Katie. So welcome, Katie. Glad to have you back.
Thank
so
you.
With that, Roberto, where do we start? How do we start the Brooklyn Show?
Let's start by Brooklyn always used to be hipsters, and I'm never going to move to Brooklyn. And I just want to know, just generally, from how has Brooklyn changed in even the last 10 years? Is it still for just hipsters? I know that it's gotten very expensive, and a lot of people moved, not just necessarily to the outer burbs during COVID, they went to Brooklyn. Are they coming back?
Well, I'm happy to start with that because I feel like I live in the center of hipster community, Williamsburg, where I believe coined that phrase hipster. And just to give a little bit of credibility for myself, I've lived in Williamsburg now. This August will be 20 years. So I have watched this neighborhood dramatically shift. And it certainly was. 20 years ago in 2003, when I moved here, it left a lot to be desired. In fact, I had a Manhattan life and I had a Brooklyn life. If I needed to go to Chase Bank or Duane Reade or any clothing shopping or that, I went into Manhattan for that. And then Brooklyn was more of dive bars, concert venues. Everything was run down at the time. In 2003, when I moved here, the Domino Sugar Factory was still operating. So, which has now been turned over and is a huge, beautiful park along the waterfront. And really in the last 10 years, the shifts that have happened in the neighborhoods I'm most familiar with because we're living here at Williamsburg and Greenpoint. We have seen, Whole Foods open up, Trader Joe's, Equinox Gym. And just in the last year, which has been really, kind of astounding to see Hermes opened up last week. Hermes just opened a 3-year pop-up while they build out an 8,500 square foot flagship store. And
wow.
North 6th, that used to be a kind of a great hangout that was all bars and concert venues and restaurants, is now Garrett Light and Warby Parker and Patagonia and Hermes and Nike and Credo. It's been remarkable what we've seen shift on the retail and restaurant and kind of.
And all that's in Williamsburg?
All that's in Williamsburg.
The Hermes is in Williamsburg.
The Hermes is in Williamsburg. It just opened last week.
Wow.
Is Williamsburg so hot because it's so accessible, right over the Williamsburg Bridge?
Incredibly easy. It's one stop on the L train. It puts you right back into, either the East Village or, the L right to 14th Street. It's an easy cab ride. We also have the ferry system, which a lot of people use. The ferry picks up in 3 different locations in Williamsburg. So getting back to the city is quite easy.
Well, Williamsburg was rezoned and upzoned tremendously. And that really, just jump started things. And there's been waves of development, there's that continue there. But you see larger buildings, more new residential there than anywhere else in Brooklyn. And also you have larger footprints to get in the national chains. Obviously it speaks to who it's attracting, that it's getting the luxury chains, not chains, luxury stores going in. But the rest of Brooklyn has much smaller buildings for the most part. And so, the cycle of who's coming in and when is different.
So is it safe to say that the original best of Brooklyn was Brooklyn Heights and downtown Brooklyn, and in the last 10 years that has shifted eastward and northward to Williamsburg, or is Brooklyn Heights still the top pinnacle of Brooklyn?
That's a good question. When I first started 20 years ago in real estate, it was really seen as Brooklyn Heights was the pinnacle. And then the neighborhoods that surrounded it, there were kind of adjacent neighborhoods, were attracting people that maybe found more value or better, types of properties, that they could afford in areas. Now it's funny to think of them as affordable, but Cobble Hill used to trade, a bit less than Brooklyn Heights. I guess to some degree it still does. Borum Hill, Carroll Gardens, and then fanning out a little bit more into downtown Brooklyn. Downtown Brooklyn didn't really have much for residential. It sort of kept, that's an area that's had tremendous growth too, and some degree Red Hook, but that wasn't really connected to Brooklyn Heights so much. And then you had Park Slope, and the neighborhoods that were, adjacent to Park Slope were attracting a lot of people too. We're talking about the migration from Manhattan, and then to some degree the migration out of like Brooklyn Heights and adjacent neighborhoods further into Brooklyn, like Park Slope area neighborhoods, Prospect Heights, Windsor Terrace. Some of the other neighborhoods, Greenwood Heights became a named neighborhood. It wasn't before. Fort Greene kind of was always doing its own thing, very small footprint, had some larger buildings go in, and now seems more connected because of the development that's happened in the area of Fort Greene that's sort of adjacent to downtown Brooklyn, and downtown Brooklyn's got built up a bit too. Now it sort of feels like all of Brooklyn is to some degree merging. You can find great coffee almost everywhere. Would you agree, Jared?
Yeah, I mean, I like to tell I always use this thing. Williamsburg is like Soho. Dumbo is Tribeca. Literally, it's converted warehouses, cobblestone streets. Brooklyn Heights, Cobble Hill is very much West Village. I look at neighborhoods and think of Park Slope being very, if you like the Upper West and the Upper East, you probably feel very comfortable in Park Slope. And I think that those, it's such a big borough that it's also, where do you want to live and what kind of lifestyle are you looking in each? So I find, when I ask people what, they appreciate that because it's, there's such a range of diversity in Brooklyn too. It's kind of more of like, what are you looking for and why?
Can we talk? I mean, it's so, I consider Manhattan pretty diverse, but it's nothing compared to Brooklyn. It is so diverse and so different. And can we just talk about just the maneuverability of the borough itself? In Manhattan, you can get around pretty easily to every corner of Manhattan. In Brooklyn, it seems so spread out and so difficult. Like if you're I don't know how you would get from Williamsburg to Sunset Park or, vice versa. It just seems a lot more limiting that way. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong at all. It's very difficult to traverse, especially going north and south. From getting to Williamsburg to Red Hook you need a car.
Yeah.
So you're either jumping on a ferry, which is, really made kind of bouncing between Williamsburg, Dumbo, Greenpoint, much easier, but there's no train with the exception of the G train. That's not a great one. It's not very connected that allows you to go north and south within Brooklyn.
So there's a lot of Uber usage.
Yeah.
Well, actually I bike a lot and that's really fun. You have to sort of plan your trip out a little differently, but it makes getting around really fun. And you realize that the distances aren't that far. There's a lot of, traffic that's kind of come up. That's happened more since the pandemic at different times of the day in terms of driving. So Ubering works, but I don't know, biking's just really easy for me, but obviously it doesn't work for everybody. And then I take trains or walk. But yeah, I'll bike to Williamsburg. It probably takes me, I don't know, 30 minutes from Park Slope, and super fun.
Has
So,
a sort of LA feel, in the way that LA is very distinct neighborhoods and it's quite hard to get from one neighborhood to the other, but it's still a very cohesive, very, very, very sort of cohesive place, in that, it has a sort of, sometimes I think of the two of them as oddly quite similarly set out.
Yeah, you're right. I grew up in Los Angeles, so I hadn't put that connection together, but I can relate to that.
Yeah.
do you miss old Brooklyn, Jared, from like the 04, 05 to now?
I do. It's been meaningful to me to kind of, grow up with the neighborhood. It was really remarkable to see that. When I moved to the city 20 years ago, I heard all these stories of, you should have seen what Bleecker Street looked like, or you should have seen what Union Square, you should have seen what Soho. And I can now say, well, you should have seen what this used to be. J. Crew used to be DFA Records, where LCD Sound System made all their hits, and the Brooklyn, the pool on McCarran, the McCarran Pool was a concert venue that was covered in graffiti, and all the fans were in the pool, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and the bands would sit up top, and that was amazing. And I was attending these events and not really thinking much of it. And then Mayor Bloomberg, donated money, and now the whole pool has been revamped and is polished and pretty and beautiful and back to a swimming pool. So to see, and with that came, I think, a lot of very unique spaces here that were restaurants or clubs or bars or art galleries that have now, we've seen come down and have turned into condos, and it's a very different kind of retail landscape as a result. So a lot of my favorite places that were here when I moved here, unfortunately, no longer are.
So what I hear you saying is that Manhattan is for bankers and that Brooklyn was for artists, but maybe now the artists have been priced out of Brooklyn, or have they been priced further away from the Brooklyn Bridge?
I feel the artists have been priced out of New York in general. I'll let someone chime in.
I came to Brooklyn in 86. I was Spike Lee's assistant and then moved to Fort Greene. So the change I've seen has been pretty incredible. But what I'll say is that it sort of feels like the majority of people who come to Brooklyn, they have an interest in being part of something that is diverse, that is artistic, that is really fun. So even if they are, bankers or working at, or Googlers or whatever, it sort of seems like they're here for reasons that have to do with what's actually happening, as opposed to wanting to. And that, I think, is great. And I think people do recognize the importance of the integrity of the neighborhoods, and that we can be a force for good, even though we are, oftentimes a big changing force as well in the real estate industry.
I can't let that pass unnoticed. You were Spike Lee's assistant in the 80s when he was making all those movies about Brooklyn, the top of his game. Could Spike Lee make a movie about Brooklyn now? And would it be like Crooklyn? No, I don't think so.
Crooklyn is a great movie. I didn't work on that one, but I was really close with his brother and sister who wrote it, and it was so close to their home life. It was lovely to see on film. I had a lot of fun in the 80s. I had a lot of fun.
Very different Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Very different. But architecturally, the things that drew me to fall in love with the area, the people, there's a lot of similarities to the way it was. There's a lot of people that are very invested in the communities in Brooklyn that went through a tremendous amount to make the neighborhoods what they are today. And a lot of them, are people who are just very involved in like community groups and neighborhood groups. And there's a lot of people I've just seen really put their heart and soul into Brooklyn. And it's just, it's not just for the newcomers. It's not just a playground for the rich, although it is a playground for all of us. But I think everybody needs to realize that the culture that's behind what's drawing you to Brooklyn is still here.
Yeah, I agree with that, Lee. I mean, even what I've seen in Williamsburg, the community efforts are astounding, and what they've done to fight for the park space and for the whole waterfront redevelopment and protecting park space. And I think that's a big appeal of Brooklyn is what we've been able to create and preserve with open space and parks.
Is that because there's less density?
Absolutely. And, the zoning, encourages that in a lower density. We're seeing more towers that are along the waterfront, but with that is coming, again, speaking specifically to kind of Williamsburg and Greenpoint, all the way from the Williamsburg Bridge to Long Island City will now be a full interconnected parkway and greenway. Very similar to the West Side Highway in Manhattan, but I always tell people the great part about Brooklyn is there's no highway, right?
Where is that greenway going to be?
That's going to run from Williamsburg. So if you can see from the bottom of Williamsburg all the way up to the top of Greenpoint. And then that also, it's not as connected, but it runs down through the Navy Yards there, and it connects down into Dumbo and into the Brooklyn Heights Promenade. And a lot of that, fortunately, was due to Mayor Bloomberg, and the city bought and purchased a lot of that land and converted that to park space.
That's great.
Yeah, it continues down to Red Hook too.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, there's some breaks going into Sunset Park and then to Bay Ridge. But there's parks that are sprouting up a little bit along there too.
So you'd mentioned architecture. I'm just curious about some of the housing stock. The housing stock in Manhattan, for the most part, when you think of Brooklyn, you think of a lot of brownstones and townhouses and things like that. In Manhattan, that makes up 3%, 4% of our housing stock. But in Brooklyn, I know it's substantially higher. Do you know more or less what percentage? And is it kind of uniformly spread all over Brooklyn, or is it just primarily in certain spots?
I don't know the percentage. It varies a lot neighborhood to neighborhood. Still, the largest part of our sales and rental market are the multifamilies, the condo co-ops, for the most part, in terms of our sales volumes. That could relate, though, to the fact that people generally stay in their larger properties longer, so.
Are people renting or buying more? What's the market looking like right now?
It's frustrating for all, I'd say. There's not enough inventory either for rent or to purchase. Jared and I were talking earlier, we're still seeing bidding wars for, I'd say the things that are more fixed up than not are the ones that are attracting the most attention right out of the gate. But instead of like maybe 10 or 7 to 15 offers, we're seeing 3 or for everything, but a lot of things that are priced right. The rental market, it's hard to price because there's a lot of volume issues, in certain categories. So a lot of times things get bid up, if they're not priced. The market is really finding its level, and it's a tough market. It's I've a college graduate, so I see it and I'm a landlord. I see it from both ways. It's like I think there's frustration out there for all involved, I'd say, except for landlords. Landlords are okay in this market.
So you guys were not nearly as affected by COVID price-wise as Manhattan was. I mean, everybody was actually going from Manhattan to Brooklyn. So did your pricing stay moderately, not stable necessarily, but like it was much less elastic than I would have anticipated?
I'd say it. I have one example. It's not necessarily representative, but it was very telling. We were pretty much shut down until June 2020. Yeah. And I had sold a house in Park Slope to longtime clients of mine. And they decided it was too hard for them to really pull off the renovation that they wanted to in the timeline they wanted to because of COVID. So they put it back on the market. We hit the market. right out of the gate when we were allowed to, make things public and go on the market and show things. And they wanted to price it below what they had paid for it. They just wanted out to move on. I said, we don't know where the level is. Let's try for more. Let's at least try to recoup all your costs, because obviously there's costs involved in purchasing, selling. So we added a bit to their purchase, from their original purchase price. We ended up getting hundreds of thousands more than what they paid for it. That's actually not the most interesting thing.
Your microphone's cutting out a bit.
Yeah, we're only catching every other word now. Can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Not sure what to do.
I've pulled up on the screen the brownstone, the classic brownstone, and it seems to suggest that the average sale price in the first quarter for a brownstone is $3.1 million. Is that accurate, Jared Lee? Is that accurate? Can I really go buy a whole brownstone in Brooklyn for $3 million?
Yeah, again, I think we have to kind of which pocket of Brooklyn are we talking about? Because
I want to be in Williamsburg with you. Can I get a $3 million brownstone in Williamsburg?
Well, and I think John, speaking about this earlier, even the style of where are the brownstones in Brooklyn? They're not in Williamsburg. Williamsburg was not a residential neighborhood. There's some that are in Greenpoint. If you go to areas like Fort Greene and Park Slope, those are brownstone driven neighborhoods.
Okay.
You can still get into a townhouse in Greenpoint and in Williamsburg for $3 million. And that's something that I've seen why clients are coming over from the city, because, that townhouse in Williamsburg that might be 3 to 5 would be twice the amount in the city, and would also be probably 10 times the amount in property taxes.
How about Cobble Hill, Brownstone, Cobble Hill?
Much more expensive.
Much more expensive. Yeah.
Cobble Hill's a very small neighborhood, and we're seeing those price points, and especially what's happened in Brooklyn Heights over the last 5 years, where there are homes in Brooklyn Heights that are selling at numbers that we see in Manhattan.
But some of the neighborhoods, the housing stock, the townhouse stock, are much larger townhouses than other neighborhoods. So in Cobble Hill, Brooklyn Heights, Fort Greene, the prime center Park Slope, you're going to see homes that are, for the most part, at least 4 stories. So you see the more modest homes in some of the areas, like in the south part of Park Slope, Greenwood Heights, some parts of Windsor Terrace, Kensington, Greenpoint, I imagine more than the center part of Williamsburg, because a lot of Williamsburg's been turned over. But I just put something into contract recently for 2.7. The ask was 2.575 in the southern part of Park Slope on 16th Street. 3-story, 2-family, suite home, some updates. If you want a house that you're willing to upgrade on your own, you could get something for around 2 million in certain neighborhoods, but a done home, you're gonna pay substantially more, even in the neighborhoods that traded for less, 3-4 years ago. Prospect Lefferts, we see the 2-story plus English basements that are fixed up now trading for around 3 million, and that's pretty recent.
So for that $3 million fixer upper, what are the taxes? Jared, you mentioned the taxes, much bigger bill.
I would say it's probably in the range of 10 to 15,000 a year.
That's not
too.
That's
not bad at all.
Low. Yeah, that same townhouse in the West Village might be 100 to 120,000 a year.
Is that one of the reasons people are considering Brooklyn, because the taxes are much less and you get more for your money? And
I think there's so much that's going into these decisions, because the move to Brooklyn is such a it's such a positive, beautiful, magical move now, but it wasn't. I've been a designer. I live in New York. My practice is as much in New York as it is in Brooklyn, and I feel that now Brooklyn is like this. It's just completely different than it was 20 years ago. And the kinds of things that the kind of lives people are living there are just, it's so different.
You made a very interesting
So much more attractive. Yeah.
you made a very interesting distinction. You said, my business is in New York, but also in Brooklyn, not Manhattan and Brooklyn. You almost consider it different from New York.
Oh, maybe that's just me. Or maybe
Okay. No, but a lot of people do that. Like I'm going into the city. And they're in Brooklyn.
That's also the other thing about Brooklyn. You know, I think to a lot of people, initially, Brooklyn felt like another state. If you lived in Manhattan and you were a Manhattanite, you were like, oh, no, Brooklyn. But now they're very intertwined, and there's no reason why you can't live and work in both places. There's no reason why you can't have a life in both places. And it's so merged now, I think, with the city, and it's so accessible in a ways that it wasn't before. I don't know if anything really has actually changed, but I think that everyone, the streets, the livelihood, everything, my children went to school in Brooklyn Heights as well. And we lived at the time in Tribeca, and it was such an easy thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I in my early years in Williamsburg, none of my friends would come visit me. I would beg and plead. I couldn't get a cab to take me over the Williamsburg Bridge.
Right.
I'd have to jump in a cab, tell them to take me towards the Delancey, and then tell them to go over the bridge, because they would not go to Williamsburg.
Oh my
I
God.
now have more friends. It's like they've all come to me, and I've had so many clients even that have moved to Brooklyn and thank me. I mean, I have one in particular, and she's a close friend. She thanks me every time I see her for helping her find
the other thing about it is that Manhattan is, I mean, not to compare the two actually, but that they are different, but there is something about when you walk around Brooklyn, the trees, the nature, the natural beauty, the brownstones, the streets, the light, the space, it's just completely it's just really lovely, and you just don't really get that in the city in the same way that you do there. And it's become worth it, I think, for Manhattanites to you thought, oh, if you live and work in Manhattan, work in Manhattan, you have to live in Manhattan. It's just not like it's not like that. It's a very, very desirable life to be in Brooklyn, I think.
And I think the design piece is an interesting one to think about in terms of the values too, because, social media and the web has really evolved in a way that people are very focused on their homes. And a lot of the rental housing stock was updated in Manhattan, not a lot, but there's a significant amount of really nice rental stock in Manhattan. And then those people end up wanting to get more space or, just get some home equity and looking for where it makes sense for them to land. And a lot of times, if they're looking at Brooklyn, they're saying to themselves, well, how do I get that beautiful finish that I want? And so they're turning to, hopefully professionals, but a lot of times, everybody's just on Pinterest, on Insta, and just trying to figure out how to get that lifestyle. So I do think the design aspect of some of the influencers have made a real impact here too.
Yeah, yes, and I think also architecturally, it was, some of the old brownstones had this sort of heritage feeling that felt rather dark and gloomy. Now, with sort of the way that architects have rethought the brownstone a little bit, in terms of taking off the back, putting glass on the back, making rooms feel really incorporated into the garden that's there, the sort of growth in that regard of making those townhouses really come alive and brighter and happier and all that kind of thing really has, I think, also kind of inspired people, actually.
Yeah.
This is a fascinating, the migration of where people come from and where they go to is fascinating to me. And I think you've touched on something very important. My daughter is 26. She gets out of college, and her boyfriend in the city has his first big job in the city. He's working for a law firm, and they rent their first apartment. What I just heard you say was when they're done renting, when the young professional who starts their career in New York is done renting and wants more space and wants to own something, is one of the inflection points when they begin to consider Brooklyn. I would imagine that when that 26-year-old becomes, I don't know, 30, 35, and they're wealthier and they're ready to buy in Brooklyn, they want more space. 10 years ago, they could afford more space in Brooklyn. Now, Brooklyn's the same price as Manhattan. So talk to me about, are they still coming to Brooklyn for more space, to hire Katie Lydon to design for them some really fabulous space in Brooklyn? Or is that changing?
I'll chime in on that because a few things. And for one, I think it's, if you ask your 26-year-old daughter where she's likely going out, she'll probably tell you Brooklyn. I think following the movement as well, I think back 20 years ago, where did you go dancing in the city? It was all the west side of Manhattan. That's where all of the clubs were. That whole movement has shifted to Brooklyn. In fact, what's happening in kind of East Brooklyn is pretty outstanding with the clubs that have opened out there and all of these old warehouse spaces, because I don't know where you go dancing in Manhattan any longer.
Which neighborhoods exactly are you talking about?
Like East Bushwick, I can't even speak. Those are parts of Brooklyn I'm not familiar with. Quite a ways out. I've been to some of these spaces, but it's been pretty phenomenal to see how many of these
East Bushwick. That's almost Queens.
There's Ridgewood,
Bushwick and Flatbush areas.
East Williamsburg has still got some fun stuff, big warehouses. I was out last night.
So are those areas that are further east as foreign to you as Brooklyn is to a Manhattanite?
Yes. For me, it's
there's not residential sales that are happening that much in those areas. So it's more of like, I'm married to a record producer, so I'll go out and see bands wherever that is, depends on the band. So yeah, I'm out, but I'm not doing sales there.
What about Bed-Stuy? It used to be like, oh, I live in Bed-Stuy, and it was like this whole thing. And now I literally heard someone the other day, I live in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And I was like, wow, that's a change. Just in the demeanor of how they presented where they lived. Has that changed? I read something that it was exploding, or just a headline.
It's such a beautiful neighborhood. It's a huge area. I mean, if you look at it just on the map, it's a big amount of real estate there. I think that there's a lot of stuff that's happening. It seems more connected in a lot of ways in terms of the services. Because again, I bike. So if I'm biking, if you're biking from Prospect Park down, you're going through some of these neighborhoods, just, down Bedford Avenue, it's the big yellow line that connects down to Williamsburg. There's a lot of beautiful new stuff going in and rehabs of older stuff throughout that stretch. But the thing with Bed-Stuy is that it underwent so much speculation. We're talking way back. We're talking in the 80s and the 90s. Things were just traded, foreclosures, things were traded and traded and traded. And it was almost like, groups of people, investors would get together on the courthouse steps and bid, and then they, buy and sell from each other. And they held and did really cheapo renos and sold out. And most of them, I think, are not trading in that area anymore. But so then people fixed up, it's like the layers of development. So people fixed those up. And then there's still some stuff that didn't trade in that period, and they need renovation. So I think there's a mix of stuff that's been renovated. There's some new things that have built up pretty big along Bedford stretch. And then, I don't know, it's very beautiful, but transportation is a little challenged in certain parts of Bed-Stuy.
And why do they leave? I know that they go because they want more space and they want to buy, and they've left their Manhattan rental in search of more space and better space. But why would they leave? Are they looking for greener, even larger spaces, a lawn, green space, schools? What would cause people to move out of Brooklyn?
Well, one inflection point is definitely schools. So the elementary schools are, for the most part, zoned. And then when you get to middle school, there's sometimes fear on the part of families because they don't know where their kids can be placed until around the springtime of the year before, they enter middle school. So sometimes families will get nervous and start looking in the suburbs, just because they're just stressed out. It all seems to kind of work out with the school stuff, but there's no guarantee for what spot you're going to get from middle school for the most part, unless you happen to be in a private that has ongoing or whatever. And then you find some inflection points in high school. So sometimes you find what I call like the sports families who they need to have their kids like out on the lacrosse field like 5 days a week. You can do it in New York, but you're going to have to be really, going this way and that. Whereas in the suburbs, it's sort of one-stop shopping for the sports, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that.
How about safety? I'm gonna so a little confession here. I grew up in Stuyvesant Town, Lower Manhattan, and I was 12 and my sister was 10, and she was playing in the park, and she was 10 years old. Some 12-year-old accosted her in the park. I mean, I don't think it was necessarily a dangerous situation, but it was enough for my parents to say, "That's it. We're out of here. We're going to the suburbs." One incident with their 10-year-old daughter being accosted by a 12-year-old boy, and they're like, "Yep, we're done." So I wonder, do people have the perception that Brooklyn, all of Brooklyn, is safe? Do they choose their neighborhood over safety, and do they leave over safety or perceived safety? I know that I just saw the Crown Heights neighborhood, and I know that the headline out here in Connecticut, the only headline we ever hear about Crown Heights is over some conflict there. So I just wonder whether public safety is one of the factors driving people in or out of Brooklyn.
Honestly, I've never heard people really focus on that. I think that sometimes there'll be an incident that'll get everybody's attention. And then when I hear of something like that happening, I encourage them, to just reach out to community officers, or there's a monthly police precinct community council meeting in every precinct in New York City, to go and talk to the officers or talk to community officials or community reps that are there. I think that, I grew up in a time, I went to high school in Lower Manhattan, and, I was out clubbing starting at 14 and taking the trains at 2, 3 in the morning. I'm only saying this because my kid's behind a closed door.
Me too, back in the 70s. And yeah. I don't regard New York in the 70s as being all that safe.
Yeah. I mean, I would be the only person on the train practically, and you'd be scared, like, I hope nobody else gets in the car. But I don't know. I mean, I think for people outside of New York, it's harder to put it into perspective, but would I take the train at 2 a.m.? No, but are there a lot more people on the train now at 2 a.m. that are going to be fine and look out for you? Yes. I don't know what to say.
Are you finding people going back to Manhattan? I mean, there's got to be some, but are you experiencing that in any measurable way? And also, are any of those people the people that came out for COVID?
Okay. I think I've been doing this 20 years. I think I lost a couple of sets through, people moving in Manhattan. I wish more people would move out of Brooklyn, because then we'd have more listings. And I like knowing, I don't know, I like walking around New York and thinking of them and like, oh, this person's here, this person's there. I like everyone I put in places to stay and be happy forever.
Yeah. Jared, you said you didn't see that COVID made much of a difference in the Brooklyn market.
I did not. And, the best I can explain that is that in Brooklyn, with the exception of the obvious of the shutdowns and things, life stayed somewhat normal in the sense that we didn't have a huge mass migration. People weren't leaving Brooklyn. And I believe it was the New York Times that had an article about that. And they spoke to like what zip codes were people really leaving from? They were leaving from the West Village, Greenwich Village, Upper East, right? Those generally were the families that also had the money to have a second home out of the city or purchase a second home out of the city. And I believe, most people in Brooklyn, or, there's some areas and some unique situations remained here. They stayed here through the pandemic. So I think just having a larger population of people here kept things more active.
And people working from home, I think, has kept, our streetscapes feeling like really lively. And I live across from Prospect Park, and honestly, it feels sort of like a carnival vibe, like a lot of days, which I find really fun. It's just always stuff going on. And it definitely would be more like you'd see that on certain holiday weekends, but now, a lot of times, just break out in the middle of the day. It's fun. Yeah.
So
John?
Katie,
John, can I ask, isn't it safe to say we had a lot of Brooklyn people moving to New Canaan and Darien and Greenwich during COVID? A lot of Brooklyn people, right?
we did. And that's why I was wondering whether it was for the green space or the schools. I heard it's a little bit of school anxiety. And certainly during COVID, there was the question of wanting more green space and the question of, well, will I ever be required to commute 5 days a week again? And if you answer that question that, no, I'll never have to commute every day the way I used to, some of those people started looking at Connecticut. And I found that more people came from Brooklyn than came from Manhattan. And I didn't, I still don't know why. I still don't know what the difference is between the Brooklyn family looking at Fairfield County and the Manhattan family. So
My theory in selling in Westport is they test suburban life in Brooklyn because it's a much more residential feel, and then they experiment, come out to at least Westport.
And what do they ask for when they get to Westport? What do they think they want the most? Well, I mean, why do they pick Westport, and what do they ask for? A yard, more space, an easy commute. I found an easy commute became less important. Schools and taxes were still the most important thing that they ask for. I have a question for Katie. What's the difference between the Brooklyn client and the Manhattan client? Are the Brooklyn clients still hip? Are they still asking for something that's a little bit more edgy? You talked about ripping off the back wall of a brownstone and making it glass. And I thought, well, that's kind of edgy. Maybe you can only get away with that kind of thing in Brooklyn, and therefore that distinguishes the Brooklyn client from.
That happens all over Manhattan as well. And that's
I don't.
growing.
I think that's a really great way to transform a often rather dark townhouse. So, and I see that just as much in Manhattan as I do in Brooklyn. And no, I actually don't see a huge amount of difference. I mean, I would say that, it's just a little thing I've noticed, which is that when, when you're designing or decorating something in Brooklyn as opposed to New York, Manhattan, I would say that there's a little more opportunity maybe in Brooklyn to do color, to just have a little bit more of that in your life. Sometimes Manhattan feels so extreme when you're outside, it's so urban. So the inside of a lot of people's homes in Manhattan is very calming and very, you get that too anywhere really. I don't know that it's a real distinction, but I would say there is a little bit more color and texture that's appreciated. I get a chance to do a little bit more of that, I find, in Brooklyn. But
and what motivates them to hire you in the first place? Are they saying, I've finally bought my space and now I want to invest in it? Or are they saying, I need you to make sense of my space. I'm going to stay here for a very long time and it's not working for my family anymore. Can you help me reimagine my space? Do they hire you at the beginning when they first acquire a place, or do they hire you to fix problems with a space that maybe they've already had for a while?
I would say all of the above. We've worked from the ground up with major renovations and major redos. I've also have longtime clients who are fixing this, that, and the other, or, it can be a lot, all of the above, actually. I don't really feel that there's a big difference, in things. A lot of design is so universal now. Everybody wants, we're also educated, and everybody, there's so much visuals reference, and it's really, it's almost like people now come to you and say, I really love this style. Can we, and they've really done a lot of research themselves, and they really sort of think they've got this vision of what they want. And so you're often, it's a slight, I find people and clients and everyone are very, very well versed in what they want.
If I can expand on that, Katie, you might see this as well. I think that there's been a shift in the last 5 years where we're seeing that kind of Manhattan money come to Brooklyn.
Yes, I would agree with that
And
too.
those are the people that are saying, all right, I can get a really great townhouse for $5 million, and I can put 5 into it, or do something like with a retractable roof and dig down my backyard and do, the kind of things that someone's doing with a $30-40 million home in Manhattan.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think also with the sort of, Brooklyn it just feels so much closer to Manhattan now than it did. And it's a weird thing to say, but it's true. And so you can, and I also think that a lot of families are, that would have moved to the suburbs are choosing to live in Manhattan or Brooklyn because they can. And so I have a client who's got 4 children, and they bought this big townhouse in Brooklyn, and that instead of moving out to a suburb, which I think they might have done 20 years ago because the options would have been so limited, now it makes sense for them to be there. And it's just, the schools are great, they're really close to Manhattan if they need it, they can live this great life, and they don't have to move out of the New York metropolitan area.
We're also seeing a continuation of what happened before, but more so the Brooklyn private schools have really increased busing from throughout Manhattan. And sorry about that. That didn't used to be the case. It used to be very rare that they were offering busing. And now a lot of the top private schools, the larger ones, are really doing a great job with busing the kids in. And so the schools that used to be, pretty easy for Brooklynites to get into, now they're drawing a lot of families from Manhattan. And then when the families, end up going to a certain percentage of their weekends spent at, parks and playgrounds and birthday parties in Brooklyn, they're like, well, we might as well just move out here.
I lived in New York, and both my kids are at school in Brooklyn, and everyone would say to me, oh, you'll be here in a year or two. We never did, but it was always a question. And so your point exactly.
They can commute to their friends' places on their own, but when they're younger, you're spending a lot of time schlepping them around, right?
Right.
Talk to me about a sense of neighborhood. I look at all these pictures of brownstones, and I think of in the old movies, everybody's hanging out outside on the front stoop, waving to their neighbor, talking to their neighbors. Is there a greater sense of neighborhood when the architecture looks like this, or have we lost that? And it's really that's just a relic of a different era.
No, that's definitely the case. And I think that COVID really brought that, to the fore in people's minds, because people were spending a tremendous amount of time, wanting to socialize, and where could you do it? People were confused, and, the stoop was a pretty big hangout.
Do you hang out on your front stoop?
I currently we own a building that has a cafe below it. So we live in the apartments above. We don't have a stoop.
You hang out at the cafe.
Yeah. There's a great sense of neighborliness, though. There's guys who, old timers that hang out in front of the corner store. It's not on the corner, but the store a couple doors down. My dog sneaks in and grabs turkey from the deli, and there's a lot of pet-centric things happening here in Brooklyn too, which is a whole other thing that took off even more after and during the pandemic.
Can we talk about the diversity of culture? Like, there is the Russian neighborhood, there's the, can you tell me a little bit about that?
I mean, you hear every language on the playgrounds. It's really fun. There's, there's a lot happening. And I think you sort of get to know people from a lot of different communities in the public schools. At least that's how I did, for the most part. But I think if you get involved in your neighborhood, you're going to get to meet a lot of different people. There's block associations, there's neighborhood associations, there's community board meetings, there's, houses of worship. There's all sorts of stuff happening. There's a lot of different nonprofits that people get involved with, and a lot of sort of ad hoc groups that form based on need. There's a lot of outpouring of support for people that were relocated here during Sandy, that from the Rockaways. They just kind of landed in the Armory, and the city dumped them here without any food, these elderly people. So everybody had to come together and figure out how to feed them, because what are we going to do? We're seeing a lot of asylum seekers being left in different parts of Brooklyn. And and their needs are not, maintained, by public, help. So that the groups are just forming, some of them are, founded at the local churches, and some of them are just, people coming together and saying, we've got to get these people winter clothes, we've got to get them school bags, we've got to get them food on a consistent basis, so there's a lot happening.
On that diversity question and all the different sounds you'll hear on the playground, I'm wondering when Katie Lydon is going to adopt a Brooklyn accent instead of whatever that is she has now. Are you thinking about it? Because Brooklyn's in. How about you, Jared? Is diversity an important part of the neighborhood mix in Brooklyn?
Absolutely. I remember a moment that was quite special to me, because I live very close to the Domino Sugar Factory. And in fact, right behind me here, I have a photo of the old changing rooms of the sugar factory when it was still operational. And I've watched that turn around. And I remember the day that park opened. It was quite a unique opportunity to enter a New York City park for the first time. And that day, it was every different mix of people in person arrived, and it was so symbolic to me. And I look around my neighborhood, and I've lived on the south side of Williamsburg, that tends to be more of the Hasidic populations and the Puerto Ricans, and East Williamsburg, which tended to be more of the Italians, and Greenpoint, which was more Polish. And I've had some beautiful stories of selling townhomes and that were owned by Italian families that were growing grapevines in the backyard and crushing grapes. And every time I had a showing there, I had to give myself an extra 30 minutes. And I had an Italian translator, and I always sat down with the owner of the home, who had fresh made biscotti and espresso for me. And those are special stories to me in my in my real estate career. And that's the fabric of the community, and that's what's I think we certainly see that in Manhattan. It's in Manhattan, but I feel like it's more present in Brooklyn.
Talk to me about the parks. I heard about this Prospect Park. I'm looking at the map now. I'll pull it up. Prospect Park seems to be like Central Park is to Manhattan, but it's quite a bit far away from you in Williamsburg. So, it's way down here. So I would imagine that when you're talking about Williamsburg, you're talking about that park that's wrapping along the river. So right. Williamsburg and Brooklyn Heights and Carroll Gardens are all defined by their waterfront. And some of the other neighborhoods have Prospect Park. Why don't you continue? Talk to me about the importance of parks to these neighborhoods as a place where people come together.
Right. Well, Prospect Park was the same architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park. So it has a lot in Central Park. I cycle a lot. So Central Park is a 7-mile loop. Prospect Park is a 3.5-mile loop. It has the band shell and a fantastic concert venue in there. You've got the ice skating rinks. It's surrounded by the library and the botanical gardens. You have kind of equivalent to Central Park's great lawn. You've got a big lawn area in Prospect Park. You've got the lake there as well. That is a well-established park that is used tremendously by the community.
But if I look at Williamsburg, I see only a couple of little tiny green dots of parks.
Sure, I don't believe there's a park in any of Brooklyn that compares to the marvel of Prospect Park. what shifted in kind of what I call waterfront Brooklyn, which is Brooklyn Heights, Dumbo, the Navy Yard, Williamsburg, Greenpoint, all of that wraps around. That was predominantly, especially in the Navy Yard and Williamsburg and Greenpoint, manufacturing. So it was all warehouse space and manufacturing, abandoned manufacturing sites. So that has been really ripe for development. And again, Williamsburg specific, even the Domino Sugar Factory was 12 acres of undeveloped land. It was mostly parking lots and things. So there was a lot of room to grow in these neighborhoods, unlike some areas like Park Slope, which have always been residential and were much more defined. So there's been a greater opportunity.
So was it the creation of these parks that you would attribute at least some of the run up in value? I mean, COVID happened, green space got valued. And the fact that you said the mayor acquired all of this waterfront, made it a park, has got to have contributed to the renaissance, if you will, of Williamsburg.
Absolutely. McCarran Park, where you just had your cursor over there on the top of the map, that left a lot to be desired. And it is now a beautiful park. And during the pandemic, every gym I knew of in Williamsburg opened up there. There was boxing, there was CrossFit, it was yoga, there's soccer fields, baseball diamonds there, paddleball, tennis courts. So there's certainly a great, that's one of the bigger parks in Williamsburg. And then the city just continues to, expand along, where we're actually building out, onto the waterfront and creating more park spaces in the areas of the Brooklyn Bridge Park and in Williamsburg, much like they did along the west side of Manhattan.
We should talk about what's on the frontier. What are the next emerging neighborhoods? I guess that would only be going east, right?
And each of you briefly, because we're into our last 2 minutes.
Yeah. 30 seconds.
I'd say the Flatbush neighborhoods are getting more known. Ditmas Park is very well known, and so is Prospect Park South, but there's a lot of other areas around there closer to heading into Manhattan, like Prospect Lefferts Gardens. There's a lot of new development that's going on in there as well. There are small and mid-sized buildings, but it still gives people an entry point. And then there's some beautiful old homes in that area too.
All right, guys, great show. We're clear on the air.
Well, thank you all. This was really great insight into Brooklyn, and I'm so glad we did this.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We should have a field trip, invite you guys out.
Yes, we'll give you a tour of Brooklyn.
Love that.
And I don't need a passport, right?
No.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It's fantastic.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, Lisa.